I'm tired of trying. Girl, you're something special, and you know I want you. You be on my mind all the time, and you know that we can't give up. Girl, you're something special, and you know I want you. You be on my mind all the time, and you know that we can't give up.
Holy shit. Drop. Yeah, good. Howdy guys. I am coming to you today from my We Are One Arrival 170. And I've had a lot of questions about this bike, and I'm quickly realizing that there is not a lot of reviews online about it. I've been riding this bike for about a year now, maybe a little over, and I feel comfortable sharing my thoughts now that I've kind of gotten used to the bike and giving a little bit of a review about what I think of this bike. So before we get started, howdy. Before we get started on the review of this, I do just want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm in no way a professional bike reviewer. A lot of bike reviewers will talk about chainstay length and seat tube angle and head tube angle and geometry and anti-squat figures. And while I do think that data is valuable, because it does give you an objective picture into how the bike is going to ride, to be completely honest with you guys, I get lost in that data a lot of times, and it starts to lose meaning pretty quickly. So I'm gonna do what I do best and give you guys my review just in terms of how this bike feels in comparison to my last two bikes. My most recent bike was a Yeti SB150, right before they changed it to the 160. And then the bike before that was a Evil Insurgent. I really like both of those bikes, but I moved on from each of them to newer bikes for improvements. And I think this bike is an improvement over both of those bikes for various reasons. So I'm excited to give you guys kind of my subjective review of this bike and how it feels to me. If you're into kind of all the analytics and all the numbers, and you want to see the geometry, you want to see kind of all the objective data, Pinkbike does have a really good written review that I'm going to link down below in the description. Feel free to check that out. I think they did a great job on the review. I do actually agree with a lot of the statements that they made about this bike. I do disagree with a few, which I'll talk about here in this video, but most of what they put in the review, especially on ascending, some of which on descending, I do agree with. And they did a great job kind of giving all those figures that are important to some of y'all. Without any further ado, we've obviously been on the climb here, so I think it's due time that I talk about how this bike climbs. This is one of the areas where I do agree with Pinkbike. Right at the top of their article, you'll see it says, "We Are One Arrival 170, the enduro race bike that climbs way too good for an enduro race bike," or something along those lines. And I agree with that. This bike climbs way too well for a 170 enduro bike. My Yeti SB150 climbed very, very well and felt probably 3% more efficient than this bike. I don't know if that's due to the Switch Infinity or if that's due to it having 20 mils less travel in the rear. But either way, this thing is very, very close to probably, in my mind, one of the best climbing bikes that's kind of in the same category. Which is really nice for me because at this time in my life, I can only afford to have one bike. In dream world, I have, 10. but I can only afford to have one. And with this bike being able to climb so well, I've been able to go ride Whistler on it, because it is an enduro bike, 170, 170, and then go pedal Squamish all day the next day, and have no issues keeping up with friends that are on 130 rear travel bikes. I mean, that's an amazing thing to say, and something that straight up wasn't possible a few years ago. So for somebody like me, that can only have a one bike quiver and wants to be able to do everything from big Whistler laps to Squamish to the gnarliest trails here in Bellingham, and then even doing greens and blues, helping new people. I was just helping my brother and sister-in-law learn how to bike a couple weeks ago, and we were doing greens and blues. It was their first time out, and I had no problems keeping up with them, even though this is a big bike. So in terms of ascending capabilities, this bike has blown me away. The only similar feeling bike, I think, that's in the same weight class as this, in terms of travel, would be the Spire by Transition. Also a 170 bike that climbs really, really well. I think this bike climbs slightly better than that. Anyway, I'm sure if you're looking into this bike, probably not too worried about how it climbs. You're probably like me and more curious about the descent. So let's get to the top and talk about how this thing descends. Okay, so now we are at the top of the trail, and I'm gonna talk specifically about descending. Now, funny enough, to talk about descending on the Arrival 170, I actually am gonna backtrack and talk about descending on my last bike and the things I didn't like that I feel like this bike addresses. So the bike I had before the Arrival 170, again, was the Yeti SB150, and that really felt like a race bike. And this is kind of where I disagree with what Pinkbike says about the Arrival 170, is I truly felt like the Yeti SB150 wanted to go as fast as possible in a straight line downhill, skipping over terrain. It was almost too fast of a bike for me sometimes. And I had two problems with it because of that. First of all, it beat me up. The suspension seemed to really just beat up my hands. The back end beat up my feet. I would feel like I got tossed around in a rock tumbler for a while when getting to the bottom. My hands would hurt after a lap. My feet were sore. I wanted something that was a little more plush. Second of all, funny enough, you'd think stiff suspension like that would lead to good jumping capabilities. I didn't feel like the SB150 was very playful in the air. I felt like I could pop decently well off jumps, but I couldn't throw the bike around. And that is where the Arrival 170 comes in and really starts to shine. You see, I personally feel like this bike has really good popping capabilities and jumps really well for an enduro style bike. And then obviously being an enduro bike eats up things on the downhill. Personally, I think better than the SB150 did in terms of a plush ride. Again, the SB150 skipped over a lot of terrain, but I feel like when I get done riding this bike, my hands don't hurt from the bumps. Oh shit, woo! That was a sketchy one. Woo! Now, that's where I disagree with Pinkbike again, because they call this bike, you know, a straight up enduro race bike, and maybe that's just my subjective opinion from riding an SB150, because again, that really feels like a race bike to me. But the one area I do agree with Pinkbike on the downhill, and this might be a downside to some people or a negative, is that this bike really requires an active riding style. The bike I had before the SB150 was an Evil Insurgent. And as most of you know, those bikes have Delta Link suspension, which is literally made to just eat up everything on the downhill. And with that bike, I felt like if I got in trouble on a technical trail, I could just lean back and put my butt over my back tire and just hold on for dear life. And it was probably gonna be okay. This bike doesn't ride that way. If you try and sit back on it, it will just beat you up. It requires a very active, very on top of the bike type of riding style, which took me a little while to get used to. But now that I'm used to it, I really enjoy it. But it might be a downside to some people because again, you do have to be really, really on top of this bike. The only times I really, really notice it nowadays, now that I'm used to riding this, is when I spend a long day in the saddle, going on like a 3 or 4 hour ride. I'll start to notice it on the last few runs. You start to get tired, you start to get a little lazy, things start happening quicker than they should, and you start maybe leaning back a little too much, and I'll start to notice it very quickly with this bike. And as long as I remind myself to stay active, stay forward, stay on top of this thing, it's fine. But it is something that you have to remind yourself of, that you can't just lean back and hold on. And that's one of the things that Pinkbike talked about that I do really, really agree with. All right, guys, to sum up this video, this bike has been a really, really good one bike quiver for me. Living here in Bellingham and having lots of really, really gnarly riding, sub 2 hours away. We've got Whistler, we've got Squamish, North Vancouver, we've got gnarly riding here in Bellingham, and then even stuff all the way down the I-5 corridor. Tons of riding in this area, tons of stuff of any ability, and this bike seems to do well in almost everything. I really have enjoyed this bike. I've really enjoyed sharing my thoughts with you guys on it. Again, if you do want more of an objective review, this has been kind of subjective, my thoughts and feelings. I am putting that Pinkbike article at the top of the description here. Check that out. They do a really good job of giving an objective review, looking at the numbers, talking about the numbers. I think they did a really, really well job. But again, those were my thoughts on the bike. They did differ a little from that article. But I've just loved this bike. I've had a great time on it, and I'm gonna have a hard time moving on to a different bike eventually. And maybe I'll have to keep this thing. Maybe it will be one that stays in the quiver. But anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and really enjoyed making this one for you guys. I'll catch you guys in the next one.